Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Curated Reality. Today we're going to talk about some stuff about building software or maintaining software. And we have the perfect guest for this topic, Raghunath. Welcome to the stream.
Hey, Vedant, nice to be here today.
Yeah,
Yes.
and also Adnan, say hi.
Hey, hi everybody.
Yeah, Raghunath, you have worked with a lot of clients, right? That means you have seen a lot of code base. And when we talk about code bases, we heard terms like good code base or bad code base. So, what are your thoughts on good code bases versus bad code bases? Basically, what are the things that makes a code base good or bad?
Hmm. That's indeed a very difficult question to start with. So, okay. So recently I was listening to one of the podcasts, right? And before we go into this thing of looking into code bases as good and bad code bases, because I used to look at code bases as good and bad, but recently my opinions have changed quite a bit, right? So recently, I was listening to one of these podcasts, and the speaker of the podcast, I can't name this person, actually used the terms real world software and lab software, right? So, so real world, there is real world software, and then there is lab software. And when you look at this, right, like you can sort of like draw parallels on how things look like, right? And most of the code bases that I have seen out in the real world, or like the code bases that even I write, um, I would not say them as good and bad. It's because either sometimes it's easy to work with, sometimes it's not. And code bases that are easy to work with are because of many factors. One is like the kind of people that they're working with, the size of the team, and also the skill level of these developers and the lifetime of the software itself. Like, is this code base like relatively new? Is it like 6 months old, or is it like a 5 year or a 10 year old code base, right? So that's what I look at it, right? And like real world code bases are often not easy to work with, and then they evoke these emotions, right? Like sometimes you're like happy or sometimes you're frustrated to work with it, and that's how I think we primarily classify them as good and bad code bases. But then to me, I just like look at them as like real world code bases and like lab software, like mostly that's how I look at it, like. So yeah.
Uh, so, how is the developer experience for working with a good code base or a bad code base? For example, suppose I'm a developer, I have joined a company, and my company's code base is not in a very good shape right now.
Mhm.
So, one way is to, accept it that my code base is bad, but I still have to add features on top of it. And
Mhm.
another way is to, uh, talk about it. It's a bad code base, and I don't want to work here, something like that. So,
Mhm.
in first scenario, how do you mentally approach this thing? That how am I supposed to add one feature on top of bad code base? Is there any
Okay.
way that I can think about it?
Yeah. So I can talk about a little bit of my experience, right? When it comes to the situation, right? So first thing is when you are working on a code base that is very difficult to work, right? So one thing that we try to do is what I used to do is I used to talk about like poorly about this code base primarily. I would tell people like, okay, this is a badly written piece of code, and like you know what, like this is something that they've done funny in a funny way and things like that. But I think that primarily stemmed from the factor that I was not able to deal with the code base, right? Like, or maybe I did not have the skills to deal with the code base, right? So once the fact that you accept that this is the way things are, and probably you need to learn a new set of skills, then I think the way how you approach code bases changes, right? Um, so one is like, especially when you are facing a code base, there are two things that I do. One is it's a internal thing that I assess if I am capable of handling this code base. If not, what are the skills that I need to pick up in order to handle the code base, right? That could be like refactoring or dealing with legacy code bases, or like picking up new skills or technology that I'm not familiar with, right? And the second thing is like the people itself who are involved in maintaining the code base, right? So that's a factor that is very crucial, because if you're working with a team that knows the code base is bad and are willing to do or try out new things, then that is okay, right? But then sometimes you get to work with team that are they know that the code base is bad, but they're like nobody wants to do things about it, and I think it's more of a people problem. So if you are in a situation where your team is also willing to fix it and like pick up new skills, I think you still have hope, right? But then if the people who are primarily maintaining the code base are not very reasonable people to work with, then it becomes much harder, and probably you should reconsider maybe moving to a different project or a different company. So that's how I look at it. And most of the times when you look at like very old like legacy code bases, there are many ways to deal with it, right? Like one is say for example, if you want to build a new feature, you can still go ahead and do the right things, right? Like maybe pick up a right architecture or start writing tests, right? So these are things that you can do, and these are things that maybe you skills that you need to develop as well if you don't really have these skills already, right? So it's primarily like you like stepping up and moving out of your comfort zone, like that helps you to sort of build on top of these bad or like unmaintainable or not so easy to maintain code bases. um, so it's definitely getting out of your comfort zone in both the cases, right? Like either you pick up new skills or like you move to a different project if your life is not easy, or like the kind of people that you're working with are very or not very reasonable people to work with.
Right.
Right, right. So one thing that like I have a slightly different opinion, right? Like
Mhm.
the way I look at it, right? I don't think there is a good and a bad distinction, right? As you mentioned, it
Mhm.
is relative, right? Like it is only good if you have never seen it before, and it is only bad if you have seen better before, right?
Right.
And this could be at various stages of your career, right? Like if this is your first year, anything that you see out there is probably going to be good enough for you because you have not seen a lot of changes and a lot of other things, right? But if you have been in the industry for like over 8 years, 10 years, right, then you have seen a lot of things at different scales and different approaches, right?
Mhm.
So what you have may not be the best thing that way, right? While that being said, right, one thing that I think the way I trying to approach is, as you said, when initially I used to have that hey, you know what, I could have written this so much better. Like this is
Yeah.
a very weird way of writing things and things, right? But then I started to realize, right, like once I started switching companies and handing over things to people when I was in notice periods and things like that and maintenance, right? That's when I started to realize, right, that what makes sense to you in your thought process as a developer might not really immediately click with the next developer who is coming in to maintain it for you, right? So one of the biggest things that I have personally have managed to gain over the last 3 4 major years is basically to have empathy. Like whenever I'm looking at code, right, like I kind of question that if it is written in a very funny or weird way which I would not expect, right? Like I kind of try to have empathy, and probably the developer did not have a choice in this matter. Like maybe he had to ship it overnight, and this was the best he could do, right? Like you don't really understand what conditions and situation that piece of code was written in under, right? Like the one thing that while that is not an excuse of any sense, I still think you should strive for best quality. But then you need to understand there is that difference, which if you're having that slight empathy, right, also makes you understand and realize that hey, you know what, whatever I write also might not be some so easily understandable to the next person, right? So you kind of tend to empathize a bit with the code basis itself. And one of the general things I think, no matter how bad the code base is, or in your opinion, right, I still think one thing that you can do is uh, leave it better than every time you edit a file, leave it better than what it was, right? So these are smaller things that I understand all companies will not have like a full-fledged tech depth sprint cycle, will not have priority that, hey, you know what, forget everything, rewrite. All of this is not going to happen in a lot of company firms, right? But then that does not mean you can't really fix it with time, right? Like if each developer takes the fact that, hey, you know what, going forward, let's. So if you think of it, right, as you mentioned, good code bases are more about structure and adherence to that structure between, like it is like a binding contract between the developers working that, hey, you know what, this is how we structure our code so that everybody is on the same page, right? It is not about how you write it, it does not really matter. It is more about how well that understanding is shared across that set of developers, right? So having said all of this, right, in your opinion, right, as you said, it is more of a people thing, right? How do you kind of tend to go about dealing with people, right? Like most of the people, if you in a new team, right, what is going to happen is if you say that, hey, you know what, let's try to be better, let's try to do this, let's try to have unit tests in place and things like that, right? They are going to be very apprehensive, right? That is human nature. Nobody likes change, no matter where you are, how you are, right? So how do you deal with such scenarios? Like what has your strategy been? How has your experience been with dealing with people? And of course this will vary from person to person, right? Like it depends on the end users, but then in general there are some patterns that you see evolving, right? Like how do you convince people? Like eventually it is, as a developer, I think it is equally my responsibility that if I want a change, right, I also should be able to convince that other developer that it is worth the time and effort that we are putting to make that change, right? How do you go about doing that and things like that?
Okay, that's a very nice question, and it took a lot of time for me to like really be. I think I'm sort of like good with people, but that it took me a long time to arrive there. So the first thing is like having empathy, right, which is very very important, right? So one of the things that I strongly believe is, given the circumstances and given the situations, people do the best they possibly can, right? So that's an inherent belief that I have with myself, right?
Right.
So which means like if your belief is driven by this, then you are like naturally more empathetic to whatever they do, like mistakes they
Right.
make or like the kind of code they write. It's something else, right? So the first thing is like, what is your belief in general towards people, right? So this is my belief towards people. So that's any actions that I do stem out of this belief that I have, right? And the second thing is, when I go work with teams, the first thing that I try to do is I try to understand what they're doing, right? Like understand what their problem is. And if they tend to do something that I don't really agree with, I sort of try to be curious and ask them why they did certain thing in a certain way, right? So that way, even before I start suggesting solutions to problems, what I tend to do is I sort of like immerse myself in the workflow that they're doing, the kind of things that they're dealing with, right? So I get to understand, because everyone has a reason on why they are doing certain things in a certain way. So until you get to the root of it, it really becomes hard for you to propose the right solutions, right?
Right.
So then no matter how long you work with somewhere, or like how long you've been in the industry, people always want to prove yourself before they will take your ideas, right? So usually what I do is like when I work with teams, I sort of like listen to them very intently. So I try to understand what they're saying. So these are like nothing related to software development, right? It's just like you being a human being who is genuinely interested in helping someone else out, right? So once I sort of like do enough of diagnosis, and that's when we start like I start suggesting what kind of solutions that they can try out, right? And if sometimes they may be hesitant, so and when people are hesitant, it could be three things, right? So it could be a skill problem, it could be a will problem, or it could be a hill problem, right? Skill problem is probably they don't really know how to do it. Will problem is like they don't want to do it for whatever reason it could be, right? And hill problem is like very very difficult to do it, right? So if it is a skill problem or a hill problem, one is like either I try to acquire the skills required, or like I try to like work as a team so that it becomes easy for them to deal with the problem. So if it is one of these problems, it's very easy to deal with. But if it is a hill problem, it's basically a human problem, like different ways to deal with it. So that's how I tend to do. So and then it's okay to have opinions and it's okay to disagree with people, but then do it respectfully. Like say for example, you are like say for example, I'm a big fan of testing, right? For many many reasons, and someone may not be a huge fan of testing, and that's okay,
Right.
right? And maybe you may not work together, and if the other person is not open enough to their ideas, or like if you are not open towards the other person's ideas, but then I think like these are the things that actually help you sort of become very good at people. And then once you sort of consistently keep delivering things, then people will start listening to you. So one of the things that I find is very difficult, or I failed so many times, is I go to a company and then I start suggesting solutions and ask people to do things in a certain way. I think that's not the right way to do it, because whenever I've tried to do that, one thing that has consistently happened is you start to create factions inside the team, right? So there'll be a
Right.
side set of people who want to do the things that you're asking to do, and there is another set of people who don't really want to do whatever you're proposing, right? Because they have their own beliefs, ideas, and they can still be correct, right? It could be the same problem, but then they can still be correct, right?
Right.
So now what happens? Like now there is a split where you have created a faction, and the company hired you to fix a problem at the first place, but then you're not actually fixing the problem, right? Like technically maybe you are, but then like the team dynamics
Right.
change, which is not really good for the company or any team that you work with. Yeah, it's just that, like nothing special dealing with people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that has always been very surprising to me, right? Like this is a very standard norm in the tech industry, right? Like everybody wants to be right all the time. Like that is the thing, right? Like everybody wants to say that, hey, you know what? I know more than you. That is the kind of things, and I have been guilty of it for quite a few years myself as well, right? Like maybe not anymore, but then in the past I know I have done that and I have tried to prove myself right. But then how do you try to like, because that becomes a very challenging position to be in, right? Like you are new to the company, so on one hand there is that pressure that you need to prove yourself to the firm as well, because they need to see why they hired you. But then on the other hand, you want to be empathetic to all your team members, right? You understand their struggles, you understand what they go through, right? So how do you tend to like think of it in a rational way, like, wherein you can balance both, right? Because you can't take one side in this, right? Because that is not going to work. If
Yeah.
you prove yourself, yeah, you might prove it to the company, but then as you said, right, in the long term the entire you have basically disintegrated the entire team which you work with. And if you take the other side, right, you have proved yourself to the colleagues and the team you're working with, but then the company is like, you have done nothing, things have, you have just become part of them itself,
Yeah.
is what the company would feel, right? How do you deal with that, and how do you think like what kind of way, like, maybe there is no clear answer to it, right? But then how do you start to think about such things, right? Like how do you try to frame it in your mind, and what are your opinions around that?
Okay. So one thing is you have to be very selective in the kind of battles that you want to fight, right?
Right.
And the second thing is about who your stakeholders are, right? Like say for example, when I usually work with companies, right? Like usually I report to someone who's an engineering head or a CTO, but then I tend to work with like a lot of developers in the team, right? Like who like
Right.
I interface very often, right? And then there are times where people want their opinions heard, people want to make decisions, right? And most of the time that's okay, and you may also know that the decision that they're making is going to be wrong, right?
Right.
And that's okay because all of us learn by making mistakes, right?
Right.
So whenever someone is making a decision, make sure that I try to have like I sort of like tend to question people to understand why they're making a certain decision. And sometimes even if they want to go ahead with it, I'm totally fine because I know like we can come back and fix it later once like things are not really out of your hand, right?
Right.
But then there are certain things that you need has to go on in a certain way because these are like high stake things. Like let's say for example something that you're driving, it's an initiative that you're running, and then you're like sort of reporting immediately to like one of the head of engineering or like a CTO. So then what happens is you sort of say okay, uh, gather as much as factual information that you can, like say for example it could be data or like statistics or whatever that is, right? Carry like do your homework, like do a lot of like be very objective, use a decision matrix, and then collect all of this information before you go like into the room and like explain your position here, right? So when things are like this, like where there are like really high stakes things that to deal with and things that I'm like directly responsible for, I tend to put my foot down and I do try to do it like very rationally, and most of the time it has gone really well. But then there are other cases where like people may be wrong, but I tend to like sort of let them go and like sort of like even like go with the flow. And maybe someday they realize and they will go like, and it has happened like multiple times, like developers would go through a certain decision and then they would think it's not the right thing and then they would go ahead and fix it. So it's all about like picking the battles that you want to fight. Like you can't like fight everything and you cannot win everything. Of course you can win everything, but then it's not going to be pleasant for anyone.
Right, right. I think I kind of like one of the things that you said, right? And that being the fact that, as you mentioned, right, like giving that people the benefit of doubt, right? Even when you know they are on
Yeah.
that wrong things, right? I think that has been something which I had a lot of luck, success using. I don't try to say outright that what you're doing is wrong, right? But then I try to ask them questions, as you said, right, around why, how did you arrive on that? Like, why
Yeah.
did you think this works, right? And most of the times, these questions are enough for them to self-reflect even before actually implementing it, right? When you ask, it is all on the way how you frame that question to them, right? Like, I tend to ask that, hey, I think what you have is right, but then let's say tomorrow this happens, how does this piece of code or this feature handle that functionality, right? Like, and in a way it is you telling them what you're trying to do is wrong, but then you don't want to basically do it in a way where without being respectful, right? Because just because you have seen it is not necessarily mean that others also know it, right? And
Mm.
I think one of the negative impacts, trends, to be, if you could call it, we have in the tech industry is that, right, that everybody tries to ascertain that, hey, you know what, you are so many years of experience and you didn't know this, such a simple thing, and everybody is trying to be like, yeah, I know that, like, and trying to prove themselves, right? And I think that's where a lot of miscommunication happens, like people not knowing stuff but still saying that I know, because of the fact just to keep up that appearance and say this, right? I think one of the things that has helped me is being very honest. Like, I am very brutally honest, and if I don't understand something, I'm like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about, can you explain it to better to me? Like, this could be even a conversation with somebody who is like a fresher in the company, right? And it is okay, right? Because like, as you said, right, it all comes boiled down to your belief systems in the longer run, that, hey, you know what do you believe? Like, I as a person, right, believe that people are inherently good no matter what happens, right? Like, uh, it is just life and situations that changes the way people behave at different points of time, right? So it is not really that they are trying to be mean to you or trying to prove you something, right? It is just that the phase, the time, and the situation they are in today is, that is what they think is the best way
Mhm.
forward, right? So uh, while that said, right, one of the things that has always been something which is very interesting to me, as you said, right, when you give that freedom, right, like, definitely you should give that freedom, make them learn, right? How do you deal with things that keeps happening repeatedly, right? Like, there are set of things that would basically, once say, there are set of teams that would, I would put it this way, right, like, once they go through that cycle of having that pain and going through it, then they realize that, hey, you know what we did was wrong. But then there would be people who would keep doing multiple mistakes over and over again. How do you tend to, like, decide what to give, and how do you let's say, like, you have to prioritize a feature, right? And how do you tend to get things done, right? Like, one easy option, of course, is to not give the feature to people who are very on that side of the spectrum, that, hey, you know what, they keep messing it up always. But then that doesn't really help anybody, right? Neither the company, nor you, neither the person, right? How do you deal with such scenarios, and, like, how does that translate into software engineering, right? Because, like, from the overview, it looks like it is more people related than software related, but
Mhm.
then most of software engineering after a certain point is more people management than actual code management, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Hmm. So, again, very difficult question to answer. Okay. So, I haven't been really diplomatic in dealing with such situations. Okay, so 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 for me, what happens is that as long someone is trying like really hard, right? I've worked with I tend to pair with other developers as well, right? So so fortunately, like I haven't dealt with a situation like this in the past like 3 to 4 years. But I'll try answering this question. So I've worked with people like people some people are like very very smart, right? Like they sort of like get it like right away, right? And sometimes it takes for other people to like sort of like what do you call it, a lot of time, a lot of tries to like get things done. Like say for example, I sort when I come across a new concept, it takes me like 2 3 passes to really wrap my head around it, right? It takes a while for me, but then it's just that I don't really give up that easily, right?
Right.
So the thing is, and when I work with companies, I want to give them the maximum potential for whatever they are paying me, right? Like, because I want the company to benefit as much as they could, right? So I sort of like tend to optimize for that, right? Like, say for example, is the company really getting the most out of my time, right? So then what I do is like when I work with, I tend to pair with like a lot of people like over a period of time, like say for example 1 year, and if it's a 5 or 6 people team, I get to pair with every individual in the team over a period of time, right? And what I tend to do is I tend to sort of like spend most of my time where the company has the most value, right? Like say for example, even if it is a person who takes a lot of time to learn things, but then this person is committed and like is like very he or she is committed, and they are willing to put in the effort, like pull the weight, then it doesn't really matter like how much amount of time that I spend with this person, right? uh, and there are also cases where people like they get things immediately, but then like they don't really care about implementing it, or like sort of like they
Right.
don't really want to do it, right? Because they feel that they have already gotten it, but don't really practice it, or like sort of like give it back to the company itself, right? So in that case, I tend to like not spend a lot of time with them, because like they don't even like come back, right? Because they say, hey, you know what, like I learned this piece of thing and I know how to do it, but I'll do it at my in my own time, right? So it's sort of hard, and I am not there to fix this problem, right? Like I want to
Right.
optimize for the team, not for the individuals, and this is something that is inborn. It's either you want to do it or you don't want to do it, right? So it really depends on like what a person is willing to do, right? So that's what I do. And yeah, so that's how I deal with it. And like one of the shortcuts that I usually do is like when I start a new assignment, right? Like I used to also spend a lot of time at the water cooler talking to a lot of people, and like sort of like gauge the scenario, so that way you know like who are all the people that you really can work with, or like are willing to work with, or like people who like basically don't care. So it's basically I'm not really sure if this is the right way to do it, but then the way how I do it is to like sort of like, okay, hey, like how much value can I add to the company, and I optimize around that.
Ye- Yes, some companies are really business focused, right? There are lots of features you have to ship every weekend or every day, and there are not much time to say, for example, write test or do a thing properly. So how do you convince the management to allot you some time to maybe do these things properly?
Okay, that's a good question. uh, okay, so let me tell you one thing, right? Like say for example, when we talk to businesses, right? um, Businesses, we all exist because the business is making money, right?
Exactly.
If the business is not making money, then we are not going to be there,
Yes.
right? So when we talk about this, right, like when sometimes I used to have this belief that I used to believe that the business does not understand what the developers want to do, right?
Right.
Right.
Right, but then I never made attempts to understand what the business is doing, right? So it has to be a two-way channel where developers also play an active role to understand what the business really wants, right? And it's also the other way around. Like the business should also understand what the developers are going through, because like we are also stakeholders of the code base itself, right? So businesses want to ship feature because they want to like reach out to more users, like they want to deliver a lot of value, right? So, and sometimes we developers have to fix things, uh, but the thing is, we are not very good at communicating what needs to be fixed, right? So, what I think like one of the things where we fall short of is we are not very clear in communicating things. Like, say, for example, when we say tech debts,
Right.
it's a very generic term that we throw around all the time and then say, you know what, like we have a lot of tech debt, like give us 20% of the time, right?
Yeah.
So now basically, it's like, say, for example, going to a doctor, and then the doctor is telling you, you know what, I have seen you, I know that you have this problem, and maybe the doctor is an expert, right? And this person really knows what he's doing, and he is asking you to take a few pills and you will be fine in a week,
Yeah.
right? And if you were the patient, will you take these pills? No, right?
No,
Like,
no.
say, for example, the moment you go to a doctor, you need to spend that 10 minutes and then the doctor needs to communicate it very clearly to you,
Right.
right? And even though the person is an expert, the patient is not going to take the medication. It's the same with us versus the business people, right? Because we know something needs to be fixed, right? And then we are giving them the pill, but then they won't take it because they don't understand our language, right?
Right.
Right.
So, so like when we say tech debt, I think like even we as developers, we don't really have a lot of clarity around what tech debt means, right? Like say for example, we say, okay, this code is bad and this is a tech debt,
Right.
right? Which is not really
Right.
the case, right? So one thing is like if we are going to communicate with business, we need to communicate in business terms. Like say for example, you have one feature in which there's like a lot of parallel development going on. Like say for example, you have a something like a home screen where like 10 different developers are adding things and like no, there is no clear ownership.
Right.
So everyone is writing to the same code base, and now you need know that whatever piece of code that you wrote last night is not going to work someone when someone merges code to the master again, right? Or maybe there's like a lot of friction because like people there are like a lot of merge conflicts, there are like a lot of dependencies. You have to stop your work before someone else work gets done, right? So then you have to quantify, say for example, it can be approximate. You could say, hey, you know what, like a lot of people are contributing to this code base. There are like 2000 lines of code, which is very hard to maintain. Maybe we should like sort of like split it into five different teams, like five different ways, so that five different teams can work on it independently and not step on each other's toe, right? So that's a tech debt that you can quantify and said, you know what, like we can ship like features 30% faster. It doesn't have to be a real number, right?
Right.
I'm not, because it's very hard to estimate it, but then you need to be very clear about what kind of technical debt that you're going to trying to solve in the 20% or 30% of time that is going to that you're going to ask the business team from, right?
Right.
So I think that
Right.
becomes very hard because for us, like when we talk about code bases, we want our code bases to be clean, right? And if we get this 20% of the time, and if we go and fix, say for example, something like a setting screen or like a screen that is not really used a lot, then that's not adding a lot of value to anyone here, right? So I think that is one thing that we have to really become good at doing it, right? So that is one thing, which is communication, assuming that your business team can listen to you, right? And this is another thing about there is one more thing that is slightly controversial. So I was working with this client, and then they had a critical feature that they need to ship, and then they were planning to raise money based on the feature once it goes live, right? Because they had like X% of growth, right? So we were in this meeting, and then I was new to the organization, and then they like we were talking about stuff, and then they said, you know what, like cut down on the tests, right? Like don't write tests, like write very minimal amount of tests. And I said
Right.
yes, right? I said like okay, I'll not write any tests, right? It's a very complex feature, and the very first day I started work, I wrote as much as test I can possibly do, and then we were able to meet the deadline as well, right?
Right.
The thing is like there are certain things that you need to take a call for on, because like the business, they say tests are going to take time,
Right.
right? But for me, like we would definitely talk about testing, but when I was building this feature, I know that I cannot do away with the test because I'd be firefighting a lot if I'm not writing tests,
Right.
right? So I went ahead, wrote every single test possible, and it was also very well documented, and nobody even batted an eye at the end of the day. Like nobody cared even if there were tests, right? As long as the feature was out.
Yes.
But I'm pretty
Right.
sure if I didn't write test, I wouldn't have been able to ship this feature on time, and in the kind of quality that we shipped.
Right.
So there are some times that you have to go just do the right thing, and it's very hard, and it's also a hard thing to say that you have to learn testing in your own time, because like not everyone is privileged, right? Like say for example, I have had the luck and the opportunity to like gain these skills like from really amazing people, so it's really easy for me to do that, right? But then people have different priorities, and expecting this from other people to do it in their own time, to like say for example pick up testing skills if your company is not giving you time to write tests, and trying to do this on your own, it's going to be very very difficult. But I think that's the sad state of things right now. uh, yeah, so I don't really know, like, say for example, I can't tell people go like learn testing on in your own time, because I think that would be so wrong to say that. But then, like, if there are companies that gives you this opportunity where you sort of you can know, like, okay, this company writes tests, right? And like maybe if I go there, I will probably pick up the skills. Um, I
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like that's the way to go about it, because it's very hard to, like, say for example, for product managers to tell you like to not hit test is like for you to tell a doctor not to do certain thing during a critical surgery,
All right.
right? Because
Right.
we don't get to tell them how to do their job, right? Because they are there because they know how to do the job.
Yes.
Uh,
So
yeah.
uh,
Right.
there's a question on our chat. Viresh is asking any detail on how you document your code mixed in legacy system.
Okay. So whenever I work with legacy systems, right? One thing I try to do is I try to minimize the amount of surface area that we get in contact with the legacy system itself. Like, say for example, if it is a new feature,
Mhm.
right? So if it is a new feature, what I tend to do is I try to build an abstraction layer and then set a clearly defined contract for it. Like, say for example, if I have to interface with the payment system, what I would do is sort of like write a simple layer that would tell me like what are all the expectations that I can have from the legacy system itself, right? So that way it is well documented, and then I try to put it under test, right? One is like you're minimizing the amount of contact that you want to do with the legacy system, and the second thing is like I tend to write, if it is a new feature, I tend to write tests, and then I build the new feature, right? So that's how I deal with new features. So that way I know like if there is a problem, I can zero in on the problem where it is, like usually the integration layer between the legacy system and the new system, and then the new system is completely well tested. Well, like say for example, I try to do the best I can possibly can with the new system. So that's how I do when I write new code. And if it is a legacy code, and if I build something that has to be part of the legacy code itself, then I also tend to write tests. And sometimes it can be hard to write integration tests within the legacy system. So in that case, I just test it manually. I don't think that's the right way to do it, but I'm also learning, and I hope eventually I'll get there.
Right. Yeah. So one of a couple of highlights, right, that since you just spoke of, just so that everybody focuses on those things. As you said, right, like it is always going to be like a bargain, right? Like no company is going to actively say, hey, you know what, go finish all your tech debts. That is not going to happen, right? Because as you said, it is a business that they need to run, and the more features they ship, the more business, the more money that comes in, right? That is always going to be, that bottom line is always going to exist, you like it or not, right? And as you mentioned, like one of the things that I have had great success with is, do not talk about what you are trying to do, right? Don't tell them. They don't care if you have to like move from rx java to coroutines, right? They don't really care. They don't care if you have to write a unit test or if you have to write an integration test. All they care is what kind of time effort is it going to take and how is it going to affect their timelines, right? One of the things that I have been always successfully managed to do is invert the equation altogether. Tell them that, hey, you know what, I could do this tomorrow. Okay, with what you want, I could do this tomorrow in your given deadline. But then, like, maybe a month from now, what will happen is you'll see a bug and the entire team will spend another week to fix it. And the cost is going to be the same. You either pay it today or you pay it a month later when a customer faces the, when you when it's inverted that way, right, it forces a lot of them to think around what you're trying to achieve, right? Like as you said, speak their language, right? They don't
Mhm.
understand what you are trying to say. But then if you tell them that, hey, you know what, if I write unit tests going forward, every feature release could potentially be like a 20-30% faster than, like, if we ship every 15 days, there is a chance that we'll start shipping every 10 days, like, because the qa cycle will go down, right? So do not talk about features, right? Talk about what they will get out of it as a company, right? And
Yeah.
I think that has been the biggest success, easy way to convince management and non-tech people, to be honest, right? In general, that, hey, you know what, this is what we can do, right? So yeah.
Yeah. And so the other thing is, one of the things is when we ask for permission, right? Like when you're going to your manager or your product manager and asking them permission to write tests, right? So you're saying, hey, you know what, I want to start writing tests, right? So now the problem is you are asking someone to also share the responsibility for your decision,
Right.
right? And this person may not be comfortable with, because like the product manager has to answer someone else, like he has, maybe he or she, they have to answer their product head or like the CEO of the company. So now when I go and tell a product manager, you know what, like we have to start writing tests and it's going to slow us down, and this will probably freak that person out, right? Because whatever you're doing is working, right? Like it may not be working in the best way possible, but it's working for
Right.
them, right? So they will not feel confident in also giving you the permission, because it's always a risk that they don't really understand.
Right, right. That I agree. Like
Yeah,
the whole point of be somebody trying to like justify your
yeah,
changes to somebody else, right? Like
yeah,
as a product manager, it is a very difficult situation to be in because you don't want to take your side or their side.
correct,
That as a
correct,
product manager, that is your role, right? Trying to
correct.
bridge the best of both worlds. But then, as you said, it is a shared responsibility all of a sudden, right? That
Yeah,
if the product manager agrees that hey, you know what, it's okay if we delay a couple of
yeah, yeah,
releases by like a week, then all of a sudden the product manager needs to justify why he or
correct,
she thought
correct.
it was okay to delay the entire release and like answer to the marketing and sales and things like that, right? So it is a very thin line to work with.
Yeah,
But then I think one of the things, as you mentioned, is getting everybody on the same page, right, as to see the bigger benefits, right? And being, and I think at times it is okay if your business is so critical and like hurting to a great extent, it is okay to write like code just works for the time being, right?
yeah,
As long as everybody acknowledges the fact that like 90% of the times you go to somebody who and say that I'm going to delay this so that I can write tests, right? Nobody is going to be happy about it and nobody is going to eagerly agree to it, right? But then I think the one great win what you can achieve is if they say no, right? If they say no, this is not going to happen, do not write it, but then you really know that eventually you want to write it, right? I tend to bargain for the fact that okay, fair enough, like this is important, right? Like I'll get this done in the deadline which
hmm,
you have. But then the next release or the one after, right, I will explicitly like mark out time in our sprint
hmm,
cycle that hey, you know what, we'll go back to this and write tests
yeah,
for this which we
yeah,
missed out as well. And that is much easier conversation and easier to negotiate because they are like somewhere down they have hey, you know what, I get my timeline, but then you have automatically set that expectation. It is like
yeah,
kind of tend to think of it as a trick. Like they agreed to you, it's just that you bought some time for them. Like the philosophy is this, right? That asking somebody for a favor, right, before you ask, give something to them so that they are
something.
entitled, like they are entitled for to give you
Yeah,
something back in return, right? So you positioning that hey, you know what, I understand your position, having that empathy that hey, you know what, I understand your deadlines and things like that, I will make sure I'll get it done within your deadline. But then I also want you to understand my position, and going forward in the next release I will mark out time, right? And that has been the most successful discussions that I have always had, be it your engineering manager or be it your CTO or for that matter product head, right? And I think that everybody understands as a human nature, right? Because hey, you know what, you are going out of your way and getting it done because even though you don't like to do it the way we are doing it, you still are going against your biases and rules to do it. So now all of a sudden you are in, they are entitled to agree to what you have to say as well, right? So that is a great way to win as well. So we have one more question in the chat as well, which is Himanshu asking, sometimes you can't meet deadlines because you need to write tests and ship a certain feature in a time duration. And just to write the test, you end up adding more time in the work hours than it is required, right? How do you negotiate with such things? Like, yeah, I think this is an interesting question.
yeah. Hmm. I think like so Himanshu is asking from a position where he really cares about the product and he wants to do the right thing, right?
Right.
Um, hmm.
Which is a great thing, by the way. Like, I
Yeah,
wish a lot more developers cared about the product they worked on.
yeah. I think it basically comes down to like estimation and product management, right? Like it's not about like writing tests or not, right? Because uh, I'll talk about it a little bit later. Um, so basically, when there are hard deadlines, right? So uh, one of the things I tend to do is like try to cut down the scope as much as I can to meet the deadline, right? Because you cannot have it both ways, right? Like you either
Right.
say, for example, you know what, like this is not going to happen, so we need to cut it down, right? And most of the time, nobody cares about deadlines, right? Like everyone wants predictability, right? Like you say, for example, hey, you know what, I understand that you need to ship this feature, but then like what if we cut down this and then like do a little bit less on the UI, right? Or like throw out the animations altogether, right?
Right.
So I think that tends to work well in most cases because you're clearly setting expectations and pushing them back before you agree on to something, right? So I think that's more of a communication and estimation problem than writing tests, right? And usually when usually people tell me that writing tests take more time, I think that's because maybe it's something that you're learning to do like for the very first time, right? Because you're probably new to writing tests, and that's okay because all of us start somewhere, right? Because most of the time, once you get like really used to this cycle of writing tests, you will find that will take you the same amount of time because there's this thing called as time to test metric, right? So how long does it take for you to write a piece of code and then verify that the change works properly, right? Like say for
Right.
example, you have a login screen, and if you want to test it how it works, if you're not writing tests, then you're going to do this manually, right? And it's going to be tiresome, it's going to be incorrect, it's going to be exhausting and non-exhaustive. You'll probably test like two cases, right? But then when you're writing tests, it's a lot more easier to do it. So eventually you will realize that this it takes the same amount of time to ship a product with or without tests, right? So generally, it doesn't take a lot of time to write tests. But then to like come back to Himanshu's question, I think if a team is pushing you like too much, then you probably have to like sort of communicate with them and then cut down the scope before you start writing tests. Because honestly, uh, uh, it takes the same amount of time. And
Right.
I can also give you an example. I was working with one of these clients, and we had a feature to ship similar one on iOS and one was Android, right? And very similar features, very similar team with very similar caliber,
Right.
and uh, uh, and I was not the one who was actually writing the tests, right? It was these were the people that I was working with, and I helped them how to write tests. So it was this team that wrote the feature, and it took them the same amount of time as the iOS team to build the same feature, right? Like the same feature, same complexity, same APIs, same backend, whatever that is, right? And then we realized like the code that the Android team wrote had like a lot of fewer bugs compared to the iOS version.
Right.
And 6 months down the line, there was one change that sort of like changed how the payment screen interfaces with the screen. And to the Android team, it was like a 1 week change, but then the iOS team was proposing to rewrite their entire code base, right? Like their code base was also much short-lived. So this was one of the observations that I made earlier. Yeah.
Right. Right. I think with tests, right, like specifically, uh, there is that even if you end up, let's say, as you said, right, like if you are not to a point wherein it does not take you the exact same time you would have written without test, right? You could, as you said, you could be learning, you don't really know so much about testing in general, and it is not really natural to you, a lot of people, right? I think the time that you would spend today is the time you would get back tomorrow when you want to like change things around that feature, or like, in terms of bugs, in terms of feature changes and things like that, right? Like one of the things that I think personally for me, uh, tests in a way has changed changes forces me to think of a lot of situations that I would normally not think of. Like as you said, right, you are building a simple login screen, and you what you would do is you test if the test for inputs, test for button clicks, network happens, success, loading state, and then get done with it, right? But then when you write a test, then you kind of tend to think that, hey, you know what happens if the network does not come back? Like there is, because for every interactive element on the screen, right, you have like a positive, a neutral, and a negative test case that you kind of think of all together, right? So it actually forces me to think of all these scenarios, and in a way it helps me understand the entire flow of the product better as well. So I save time when which I spent in writing tests, right? I spent So when I actually go to write the feature now, right, it is very simple for me, right? Like I already know what the flow is going to be, what it is. I don't have to think for the logic. So every time, this is how we write code, right? Like you start writing a new feature, you look at the screen, and then you look at what you have today, and then you start thinking how you can fix it, how does that, the whole mental model that you build, right? So instead of building it at a screen level every time, I would rather build it when I'm writing tests for the entire flow and understand the flow better, and then you cut down on your coding time altogether, right? Like the feature code itself becomes very limited. All you're trying to do is ensure that your feature passes those tests, right? That is all your end at the end goal, that way is.
Yeah.
Cool. uh So we have been talking so much about testing and things like that, right? One of the very interesting aspects that we wanted to slightly touch about today also with you was you being a independent consultant contractor for a lot of companies, right? And it is a very different role than what everybody is used to, especially if you like within India itself, right? It is something which is not so common like it is outside everywhere, right? What kind of challenges, or like, let's talk both, right? What kind of advantages do you see? Like what do you like about it? But then there is also that challenge aspect, right? Like every time you work with the company, there are access related things, there are information sharing, context sharing, and that is very limited since you are a third party consultant and not really a full time payroll employee, right? And of course it depends on the kind of arrangement that you have. Like there are companies who would just onboard you full time for 6 months, even though you're a consultant. But there are some companies that would be just like, hey, you know what, this feature does not work, you get this working, this is your only thing that we need your expertise and consultation with. How does that work? What do you like about it? What do you don't like about it? What were, in your experience, what has been the best things that have happened, and what have been like the most frustrating things that you go through?
Okay. Hmm. So I'll talk about the perks first.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the perks that you get as a consultant is you get to work with a lot of different kinds of people, right?
Right.
So when you work with a lot of different kinds of people, like people from varying backgrounds and like various capabilities and ideas, right? You get to learn a lot from like every single person in the team, right? Like say for example, it could be an intern, but then this person may have specialized in something that you have no clue about, right? So that is one thing that you get used to, because like you get to interact with a wide range of people, right? And the second thing is you get to work on a different set of problems that other people don't work on, right? Like say for example, uh, uh, they hire you as a consultant because they have a problem that either like they think you could help them with. Like say for
Right.
example, uh, they have problems shipping faster, or like figuring out an architecture, or like they have code bases that like nobody wants to work with, and then they're trying to find someone who can like sort of like
Right.
take this piece of code and like help them out with, right? So which
Right.
means the
Make it
problem,
your, make
yeah,
it your problem.
yeah,
It is
make
no
it your
longer
problem,
our
right?
problem.
And one of the funny things that I've experienced as a consultant is like generally like these things happen via referrals. Like now people talk and then say, hey, you know what, like I know someone who can actually help us out in this area, and that's how the conversations begin, right? And usually when I go work for a client, right, like they sort of like ask me about all the problems that I've solved earlier, right? And then they hire you and then throw a problem that is completely unrelated to the previous thing that you've solved, right? That's the funny part, right? Like people don't hire you for the thing that you have done already, right? Like they hire you and then give you a completely different problem, and most of the time I'm out of my comfort zone, like learning things that I've never learned before, right? So that's something that can be fun when it is like of the right amount of difficulty, but it can also be frustrating when it is incredibly hard and like it's completely something that you have never done before, right? Um, so the thing is, you tend to learn like a lot of different things, right? And once you sort of like solve a very specific set of problems, like say for example, these days I tend to focus mostly on I don't do new features usually these days because now I'm more into territory where like, give me all the code base that you don't like and give me all the code base that you're afraid to change, right? So that sort of thing. So then you sort of like tend to develop a skill set that is very niche from the market, right? Like say for example, you
Yeah.
don't see job descriptions for these kind of problems, and getting hired into these roles are like is like a lot more easier, right? Because when you know that people know that you can solve these kind of problems, they just hire you. There is like no interview process and stuff like that. So
Right.
that's something that you can that's one of the perks of having a very specialized skill set, right? uh, and what else can I think of? Obviously, the pay is good, and there are tax benefits. And then you do have like some amount of control over your time, right? Like, say, for example, you can say, hey, you know what? I want to go take a leave, and I think that's something that you can like, I don't know if that is true, but it gives you a sense of a lot more control over your time, right? Like maybe
Right.
I know that I can take like a 2 month off, but then I've never done that like so far, right? But then I still keep telling people like I have control over my time, but but I don't know if that is really true, right? But that's something that I tell to myself. Maybe I'm lying to myself about it, but that is one thing. So those are all the perks that I can think of. And talking about problems, right? Problems, I think I used to work mostly for clients outside India earlier, but then for the past 4 years or so, I've been working mostly with clients in India. And I think culturally we have evolved. So it's very hard for you to figure out if there is a cultural fit between the two, right? Like say for example, are you really so you have to gauge whether the kind of work that you're going to get into and the kind of people that you're going to work with are going to be a good fit, right? So that is
Right.
something that is very hard to figure out. It took me a while, but now I think I can fairly confidently tell that I can sort of like pick out the right problem set and kind of pick out the right kind of people to work with. But I think that is something that you um, uh, that's hard for people to understand, and it comes with practice. I don't know if there is a better way to do it, but then that takes a while. And especially if you're starting out, it can be really hard to find a problem because like I started as an Android developer like 10 years ago, and then it was a very sought out skill set, right? But then now, for someone to start out as an independent contractor for Android, I think it would be very incredibly hard to start out, right? And other challenges is like say for example, all the grunt work that you're supposed to do, like say for example, raising invoices, sharing
Right.
timesheets, and getting your taxes filed, having an auditor, like all of this, like getting your company registered, all of these things um, can be slightly frustrating sometimes. But I think there is a price, there is a fee to pay for everything, right? And if you want a consultant, then you're supposed to do this. And I don't really mind about medical insurance or other sort of insurance because that's something that, but then like now it's on your thing that you have to do your own research and get things
Right.
because they're no longer covered by a company. So those are some of the disadvantages. Like I don't think like the disadvantages are like a lot. And the thing is, you need to have like very good people skills. So that is something that you need to pick up because you'll be like working with a lot of people and getting things done when there are like a lot of different opinions. I think that can be quite challenging. So if you are a person who can do this already, then it's going to be easy. Otherwise, it can be difficult to do that. Hmm. What else can I think of? And also, if you're starting out, getting paid, yeah, so that is a challenge. So literally, like the amount of outstanding invoices that you can have can be challenging as a beginner. These days, it's not a challenge anymore. But then, if you're especially starting out, that can be a challenge. And the second thing is also one of the pitfalls I would say is not to get over enthusiastic and sign up too many projects because that will burn you out. So that is something that you have to watch out for because there will be times where there are ups and downs. So you would probably get like a lot of projects at one time, and then there will be a certain amount of downtime in the like some parts of the year. So that's something that's very hard to predict or optimize for, right? Uh, so that can be a challenge for people who are starting out. So luckily, I've reached a position where like this doesn't happen anymore. Like sort of like there is always work. But then I think that's something that can be challenging if you're starting out. What else can I think of? Those are all the disadvantages, I guess.
Yeah, like I think, as you said, right, there are both good aspects and bad aspects to everything. There are sacrifices that you need to make, right? And like of all the points that you made, right, I think one of the biggest, a couple of them which were the biggest were for me, especially, were the fact that uh, in terms of a positive, then it is like you have more control over your life and the kind of work you do, right? Like you are not stuck, dictated by somebody that this is what you need to finish today. Like you decide what you want to work on, you choose which project to. But then there are other downsides of it also, as you said, that uh, there is uncertainty at a great extent, right? Like what if your contract is not renewed by a particular client and you don't have anything lined up, and let's say everybody, like in a time like COVID, right? And if you all other clients have, like, dried up in terms of leads, right? That can be a little challenging to manage, like your finances and your lifestyle around it, right? Because there, as you said, there could be months of gaps between of months that you could have nothing to
Yeah,
do at all,
yeah,
like at
yeah.
times, right? So how do you survive those? Like and that is just something which you need to plan extra, right? Like have
Correct,
enough savings that, hey, even if something like this comes up, I should be prepared for it. You can't just
correct.
go say that every month I'll have a new project to work with, right? That is not going to realistically happen. But I still think, as you said, right, the pros also are decent enough to definitely something that people should consider. Like I actually think what I like about that kind of this is you have the freedom to work on multiple things, your own side projects as well if there are, right? And not having to deal with like office and things like that on a regular basis. So it is a catch 22 situation, I would agree. But then uh, for people, as you said, right, starting out just now, maybe it might not be the best idea to just do only that. uh, it might be to try and do a mix of both, like try to take a part-time job or like a 6 month contract, like full-time but a 6 month contract, instead of doing like a full-time job, right? That, hey, every year I'll do go through the appraisal and things like that. You could just say that, hey, you know what, 6 months I'll work for you dedicatedly, and then later on we'll decide and things
Mhm.
like that, right? So that becomes easier, and it can give you that taste whether you enjoy it, and can you like live with the pressure of not having something for 2 3 months, right? And without having to risk too much, right? As you said, if you're just starting out, then it might be like a bad thing to be positioned to be at, because if you don't find anybody in 3 months, right, you have no backup options, right? What do
Yeah,
again go back to that same cycle of finding a job, trying to, and in the 3 months is a long time to be out there without a job for your regular motivation, right? So it affects your job interviews and things like that as well.
yeah. Yeah, I think like I didn't touch upon the financial aspect, right? Like because
Right.
like you said, you need to have like enough runway to sustain yourself. Like say for example, if you have a family, you also have to probably optimize for that, right?
Exactly.
So because if you want to go through these ups and downs, you also have to make sure that you have like saved up enough and you're controlling your expenses. So that way, even if you're out of a job, you're not panicking. Okay, like I have enough runway to figure this out. Yeah, that is a very important aspect. If you're being a consultant, yes.
Right. Like
Yeah,
ideally, it makes sense, right? That at least 6 months worth of saved up, right? Some sort
yeah,
of a this, so that even if you are unemployed for like 6 months with no
yeah.
projects, you at least don't have to give up on your lifestyle. It's not
Correct.
like tomorrow you have to like move out of your apartment, sell things that you own, right? Because
Yeah.
that is a very bad situation to
Yeah.
be in.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest thing for me, like I used to be a freelancer for one and like the very first time, right after out of college, I chose to go down that route, right? Like I used to be a freelancer for 1.5 years, and when you used to get a project, it used to be like full, as you said, right? Like there would be months wherein we actually had to reject projects, saying that there is no way we'll be able to deliver it because we already have four parallel things going on. Let's not take it up. But then there would be months, like 3 4 months, wherein nobody would want to do anything, right? And one of the bigger challenges there also is closing projects and contracts also takes a longer extended time. Like maybe even if a client is interested or a company is interested, right, by the time they actually sign and you actually start, there might be like a 2 3 month period before all of that happens, right? So it becomes very tricky that way to deal with those things as well. Cool. So apart from this, right, like I think that is majorly what most of what we wanted to cover.
Mhm.
But then, from your perspective, right, if people are trying to get into this field, like I think one of the, let's assume that somebody has taken the decision that I want to be an independent consultant and go down that route, right? How do you recommend finding their clients, and like how do you approach people, right? Like how do you go about trying to, like today I understand it is majorly referrals and word of mouth after a certain point, right? But then before that, how did that work out for you? How did you find your first set of clients, and how did that work?
Okay. So when I started out initially, I used online platforms like Elance, Freelancer, People
Right.
Per Hour, and they're like other like Code Mentor and all these platforms. So that's how I started finding out clients for myself, right? Um, so that's how it started out for me. And then I've had leads from Stack Overflow, surprisingly. Like, say, for example, I've answered a few questions, and like one of my largest client, largest contracts, right? Like, so which helped me to work with companies like Glenlivet and Tiffany, Mizuno, all these like really large corporations, was through some of my Stack Overflow answers, and even. Uh, I don't remember the name of the company. Sorry. So one of like the media companies from the US also like they approached me because of one of these Stack Overflow answers that I wrote. So that's how it started. But then later on, what happened was most in these platforms usually people compete based on pricing, right? So the
Right.
pricing is how most people compete with. And I also noticed like a lot of people who signed up, like companies that signed up large contracts, would have full-time teams that would send bids on these platforms, right? And then they would like sign up any
Right.
kind of project, right? So I don't think that's very viable for a freelancer, right? Because you cannot like pitch on every project regardless of the budget, right? Because you have your own set of skills and you can only pitch on projects that will sort of uh, that you'll be able to complete, right?
Right.
So those are the things that how I initially started with, and it sort of worked well for me up to a point, like to a certain extent. So that was one thing, and the second thing is I got really involved in the community, right? Like right now, I'm very much involved in the community. So now what has happened is like I tend to work with like some of the people, like I've worked with like a few people here in India as well, right? And most of them sort of like they sort of recommend me in their organization when they have other problems to solve. So that's one way it happens. And the other one is like based on the clients that I've worked in the past, they go talk to someone else, right? So that's how the leads get generated, and I don't actively do anything to generate leads particularly. So it's basically the clients I've worked in the past referring me to other people, or like people I've worked in the past referring me to new companies. So this is how it has been happening to me organically. So I don't really know how to sort of like go ahead and do this right now, and I don't know how the world works in 2020. So I don't think I can answer the rest of the question. So
Right. Right. Yeah. Cool. I think, yeah, that is all we had for today, at least. Like,
Mhm.
this was very helpful. Thank you for taking time to talk to us. This
Yeah.
is something which we like definitely interested to, to wanting to want. We have been talking about trying to get you to have that perspective, like as an independent consultant, and like was working with multiple code bases, right? How does
Mhm.
that feel? So I think today's discussion was very helpful for us, helped us understand, and I think it sets a lot of clarity in terms of how do you approach things. And like in all honesty, we spoke more about people management than
Mhm.
coding, but then that is the those are the skills that will matter more after a certain point to most of the people rather than the coding, right? Like you can learn coding, but people management is something you is harder to achieve, right?
I think both of them go hand in hand. Like, say, for
Right,
example, skills are why people are seeking you at the first place, right? Like, unless and until you have skills that are like not like sort of not easy to find,
right.
it would also be a hard sell. But then, like, having both like people skills as well as technical skills is equally important if you're trying to like sort of set yourself as a consultant.
Right. Right. Plus, I think that inherent expectation that you are an expertise in what you do, right, is there, right? Because that is the only reason why you would hire a third party
Correct.
consultant, right? Because
Correct.
else you already have a team which is there.
Correct.
And
Very
if
capable
you
of doing
do,
things. Yes.
right, and if you also do the exact same thing like what they are doing,
Correct.
then what is the point of it, right? So I think that is true. I agree. Wherein you also need to have strong tech background and skill sets, proven skill sets to showcase that, hey, you know what, I'm capable of solving the challenges that you're actually facing
Right.
as well.
Okay, I think that's all for today, folks. Thanks again, Raghunath,
Cool.
for joining the stream, and thanks. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Bye, everybody.
bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank